Hi, it's been a little while. You might not have missed me, but I have missed all of you. I've actually been away for over a month. You've probably seen me during Summer of Synths, but that was shot before summer. So I wanted to kick things off with something that I get a ton of messages about, and that is, why doesn't my synth setup work? But I don't want to talk about specific technical issues that you might have with your setup. Instead, I want to talk more generally. So perhaps the following applies to you. You wanted to make some music, so you bought a lot of synths, and you watched all of the YouTube tutorials, and you learned about sequencers and oscillators and frequency modulations, and you tried to make your synth setup work, but now you're finding yourself increasingly feeling frustrated by the setup, or just not feeling it at all, and you aren't making a lot of music with it, and the synths are just sitting there unused, and a hobby that was supposed to be fun just makes you feel ashamed that you're not finishing any music. Maybe this applies to you, or maybe just parts of it. It's easy to feel frustrated when you've invested into something and that something isn't doing it for you. So I'm here today to talk about 3 reasons why we are experiencing this, because I experienced this too, and a few things you can do to rid yourself of some of that frustration or just lack of motivation to use your synths or your music setup. And part of the inspiration for today's video came from Summer of Synths. So if you don't know, every summer I invite 4 or 5 guest creators to make videos here for my channel, because I think it's important to sort of shine the spotlight on other talented creators. And a reoccurring theme in Summer of Synths has been making synth setups that actually works for you and not against you. So this year we got to see, for example, Slow Haste present his small electron setup. We got to see Nadia explain her live setup, and James and Nathan Jones talked about the hurdle of getting his setup to work for him and not against him. And a key takeaway from Summer of Synths for me is that when people build synth setups that work, it's a balancing act between 3 different things. Firstly, we have the love for gear, the passion for the synths and music equipment. This is the nerdy side that we all sort of have to deal with. The second thing is how you create a setup that exists in the space between too complicated and too basic. A synth setup that gives you room to grow creatively, but is also not overly complicated. And thirdly, having realistic expectations about what you can actually do with your synth setup given the amount of time and energy you have at hand. So let's talk about the first aspect. You love gear, and this might seem obvious, but it can be painful to accept because you are a nerd and you love gear and cool stuff, and you might have bought too many synths too fast. And because you are financially invested, it feels like a failure when you can't get everything to work together, or you aren't using the gear for something productive. Now, the good thing is you don't really have to worry that much about this, because it's all very normal. We've all been there. It's easy to get carried away, and when the honeymoon phase is over with the gear that you bought, you're left with this kind of bitter feeling, like, wasn't this supposed to amount to more? So what being a synth or just gear lover in general leads to is often too large and often too complicated setups for your actual skill level. You likely bought too many things with overlapping functionality, and you might have issues making everything work together. The more synths you connect together increases the likelihood that something just doesn't work. It could be MIDI issues, it could be audio routing issues, it could just not be able to record things as easily as you'd like. And the solution here is pretty straightforward. You need to be able to turn your setup on and just get going. If you look at all the Summer of Synths guests that I've had here on the channel, something that's very common is that they test a lot of gear and then they stick with the things that work for you and not against you. You really don't want to spend a ton of time learning new gear and troubleshooting stuff when you might only have a few hours for your hobby every week. So let's talk about reason number 2 why your synth setup might not work for you, and that is that you probably have a too overcomplicated setup for your needs. So we are all guilty of this, even I, somebody who makes YouTube videos for a living. You likely looked at other people's setups before you started building your own, and the problem with this is that we're all different experiences, we have different skill level, we have different goals and aspirations and different budgets, and so it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that what works for a person A works for you. And in my experience, this leads to people overcomplicating their setups. And in a way, I've also contributed to this issue when I built a massive synth setup, and I just saw Loop Up, he showcased his setup, which is wildly complicated. But here's the thing. These complicated setups do work, but they're built for us and not for you. For example, I went to my friend Aura's studio. It's one of the Summer of Synth videos this year, and he has this beautiful, like, massive synth studio. It's like the dream studio. But the thing is, he also talked in the video about how it's based on a long experience of producing music, and he also works full-time with it. So building a massive synth setup like Aura's, if you only have a few hours a week to spare for your hobby, it might just be unrealistic to think that you can actually make something out of that. Or maybe you can and you're built different, but just be realistic about it. And this leads me nicely to my third point. Reason number 3 why your synth setup might not work: unrealistic expectations. So you want to make electronic music, you also want to have a fun hobby, and you also want to collect a bit of gear because synths are fun and music gear is amazing and you like to own them and have them in your studio, and it's cool, it's blinking lights, makes beeps and bloops. I mean, who doesn't love that? But you also feel a need to be productive, maybe post jams and upload music. Perhaps there's a lingering sense that if you are not producing music that people actually listen to, you are a failure. But at the same time, you have to live a normal life with normal obligations and normal struggles. So you might feel this way, or you might relate to only parts of it, but what it hints at is that your expectations might be unrealistic. I had a friend who was working in the music industry, doing great work which relates to synths and music, but who wasn't really living off his own music. He wasn't a pro musician or producer. So he asked me, what's wrong, Bo? Why don't I turn on my synths that often? And I asked him a question in return. Why would you? You have a full life already. You're doing creative stuff. When do you actually see yourself having the time and energy to turn on your gear and make music? So it's easy to fool ourselves that creativity doesn't abide by the same laws of mental and physical energy that everything else does. But in my humble experience, having worked with music and also YouTube since 2020 full-time, being a creative is far more sensitive to your energy levels, and it's incredibly hard to push yourself to create. So how do you deal with unrealistic expectations? Well, it all starts with a goal. What's the reason you built the synth setup to begin with? Is it to release tracks? And if so, did you build a synth setup that actually works for that? Or is it maybe the case that all these hardware synths are getting in the way? Are there conflicts here that needs to be resolved? So I struggled with this when I became this kind of synth YouTuber guy. I thought I had to release a ton of music to be considered legitimate, but I had already sort of put my artist career on the shelf, and YouTube was a new way for me to explore music and also teach. So I pushed myself to the brink of exhaustion, keeping up with family, my job, my YouTube channel, making music, making samples, and for what? What did I in the end achieve? And for whom? So I stopped. And now I focus more on the things that I value and not some unrealistic idea of what I should be doing. So your gear doesn't have to be the problem here. It could be that the goals are a bit unrealistic. Or it's not a goal that you truly value. Ask yourself what you truly want to do and why. See what answers come up. Perhaps you just want to enjoy a bit of electronic music jamming in the evenings and buy a new synth now and then, and yeah, why is this wrong? I mean, do you really have to make your hobby into something where you're productive? Aren't you productive all day at work? So maybe the world doesn't need your music output actually, or maybe it doesn't really matter in the end, because you need your music. And if I want you to take anything with you, remember this. Goals relate to 3 factors: time, energy, and skill. You need to develop skills to reach goals, but that also takes both time and energy. So unless you have that time and energy to invest, how are you going to reach the goal if it's set very high? If your life is already crowded, how can you make room for it all? And so, for a goal to be realistic, it must align with your core values, and you also have to have time and energy to achieve it and the necessary skill required. And for most of us with like a normal life, the creative goals have to be balanced against other things in life: children, partners, family in general, other hobbies. And being accepting of your limitations in life is key to be able to enjoy things without constantly feeling like you're doing the wrong thing. So in the end, the reason why your synth setup might not be working for you is that you have too much gear and an overcomplicated setup in relationship to the goals you've set. And you have to ask yourself if those goals truly reflect what you want to be doing and if they are realistic given your particular situation. being a parent, having a full-time job, and on top of that making and releasing music is a difficult thing to balance. Or you're going to university full-time and also pursuing an artist's career, or you're working 2 or maybe 3 jobs and also trying to make it as some sort of creative. Like, we can come up with a number of situations where it's really clearly difficult, given the situation, to fit everything we want in our lives. And I'm not saying that you can't make it. I'm saying be realistic, that the gear isn't the real issue. The issue is your choices and how they relate to what you value. And figuring out what you value could be one of those things which life is truly about. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something out of this video here. I love to do these like more reflective videos now and then. I know my channel is a lot about gear and I showcase new and cool stuff, and I kind of want to offset that or balance that with these more reflective pieces now and then. Just because I showcase a lot of stuff, that's what I truly want to do. So I do what I want to do, but it doesn't mean that you should go out and like buy everything and build a super complex setup. Instead, watch Summer of Synths, learn from people who have more experience about their issues and what they did to solve them, and also just look at like basic tutorials, basic setups, and try and figure out kind of what works for me and what goals are important to me. So, hope to see you all in another video.